Aren't video games great? They allow us to escape the reality and not have to face the fact that we are nothing but worthless, useless, uninteresting disappointments on our entire family and friends and co-workers, and nobody will actually love us for the entirety of the rest of our lives. Okay. That got a little out of hand. But video games are great. They are one of the most, if not the most popular entertainment medium on the planet, and have come so far since the beginning that there are titles that are drastically and unequivocally important in history. And that is what we are looking at today. I am Walter from Unlimited, and this is the top 10 most important video games of all time. Number 10, Resident Evil. Say what you will about the voice acting, the cutscenes, the replayability, the weird story, the bad dialogue, and a lot of it. But you cannot deny the fact that this game is one of the most important in history, because it took a genre that had some gems, survival horror, not the most deep genre to that point, or even to this day, but it made it mainstream because everyone knew Resident Evil. When I was a kid, everyone talked about how terrifying this game was, about how they watched their big siblings play it, and how scary it was, and how much they jumped and fled in fear of the imagery they were seeing on their television coming from their siblings' PlayStation or even their own PlayStation. That is a monument in gaming history, because no game to that point was that scary. No game to that point evoked real, visceral fear like Resident Evil did. The scene about 20 minutes in, when the dogs jump through the window the first time, is still, to this day, one of the most terrifying moments in gaming history. You can say that there were many better games in this series, and you'd be right, especially Resident Evil 4 and the remake of Resident Evil on the GameCube and the re-release of that remake on next-gen consoles. But you cannot say those games are more important than Resident Evil, because without the original Resident Evil success, the groundwork that those stood upon would be nothing. Number 9, The Elder Scrolls III Morrowind. Speaking of games that laid the groundwork for much better games in their series, this laid a hefty, sturdy ground on which Oblivion and Skyrim were built upon. Because up to this point, the Elder Scrolls series was very much your average dungeon crawler, but in first-person perspective. Morrowind took it to a vast, immersive, seemingly living world where there were cities and side quests and all this stuff to do. And you would just get immersed in everything in the environment. Nothing was like that before. And it's made one of the most popular video game series of all time, because people will buy Elder Scrolls games, and not for the story, but for everything else. All the freedom to explore the world, to use your magic, to level up in unique ways, to give yourself certain skills, to fight these majestic, gigantic, intimidating beasts, and go into this dungeon and get past the giant boss at the end of the dungeon. Finally, it laid the groundwork for one of the best video game series of all time. And at number 8, Final Fantasy. The original Final Fantasy on the NES is one of the most important games in history because more than most others, without this game, you wouldn't have the other games in this series. This series has lasted over 30 years now. And it wouldn't have lasted anywhere near that long had Final Fantasy been nothing less than a success. Because the survival of the game studio relied upon the success of this game. And it succeeded. It didn't succeed as well in the United States as future installments such as Final Fantasy 6, 7, 8, and 9. But in terms of global success, it was a smash hit, specifically in Japan, and kept the studio alive, and they kept turning these games out. Where today, we're at Final Fantasy 15, and the evolution of the series is to a point where it's almost unrecognizable. But you go to the original, and you'll see tropes that you see in most of the Final Fantasy games. Large parties, large selection of characters, overarching stories, immersive environments, random encounters, and none of that would have branched off had we not had the original. Number 7, Wolfenstein 3D. Wolfenstein 3D is the pioneer for a genre that has made the video game industry ridiculous amounts of cash. You could make up a number, and the first-person shooter genre has probably made that much money for one developer or another, let alone the entirety of the video game industry. Wolfenstein 3D revolutionized video games in general, because for the first time ever, it let you look from the perspective of your character and shoot people. It's one of the most common and overdone genres in gaming history, but it all started with Wolfenstein 3D and shooting Nazis and going through the levels and then coming up against the big bad Mecha Hitler and taking him down in one of the most ridiculous looking boss fights of all time. Number 6, Grand Theft Auto 3. Grand Theft Auto 3 revolutionized a game series that would become the most controversial game series of all time. Grand Theft Auto has more controversies, more individual things that have riled up the mainstream media than any game series in history. And it all started with Grand Theft Auto 3. The vile, awful things you could do to people in Grand Theft Auto 3. You could go to the streets and mow people down with machine guns. You could go get hookers, finish with them, and then run them over and take your money back. You had the freedom to do all this on a giant open map with a living environment that responded to your actions. And that was something we had never ever seen before. That your actions would affect this entire environment of your game. And it would only grow from there. Going from Grand Theft Auto 3 to Vice City to San Andreas to 4 to 5. And all these games owe everything to Grand Theft Auto 3. Grand Theft Autos 1 and 2 have their place in gaming history and their mass importance, and do not underestimate the mass importance of them. But It did not touch the importance that Grand Theft Auto 3 had to not only the Grand Theft Auto series or the sandbox game genre, but to video games as a whole. Because the Grand Theft Auto series is one of, if not the most high-selling series of all time. Grand Theft Auto 5 set records for fastest-selling video game on its release. It is 4 years after it's been released, and it still moves copies at an alarming rate. And that game wouldn't exist without Grand Theft Auto 3. Number 5, The Legend of Zelda. The Legend of Zelda gave us many, many, many innovations. The overtime collecting of different weapons. The concept of going from dungeon to dungeon collecting things to get yourself prepared for the final boss. But most importantly, it gave us the most simple and expected of features in a game. It introduced the ability to save your progress. It introduced the concept that you didn't have to beat the game in one sitting, that you didn't have to sit from beginning to end on your couch to win a game, to beat a game. It made it so you could save your game, go to bed, wake up, turn the Nintendo back on, and you would be at this, and you could be at the same place you were before. That may be the most taken advantage of and overlooked feature on games now, because say a game comes out tomorrow and they say there is no save feature. It would be drilled into the ground. It would be panned by critics, the public, everyone. But it didn't used to be that way. The Legend of Zelda introduced the feature, and it was groundbreaking. It was unheard of to be able to save your progress. And this game, this one game, introduced it. And ever since then, it's been a staple of the video game industry. Number 4, Diablo. Diablo pretty much resurrected an entire genre. Western RPGs in the modern day would not exist if not for Diablo. Now, Western RPGs can go a lot of different ways. You can look at a game like, say, Mass Effect 2, and then look at Fallout 3, and then look at Diablo 2. All Western RPGs that play very differently, that have very different tropes, that can even say don't even look like the same genre. But the Eastern dominance of role-playing games on PCs and consoles was very much alive in the 1990s. But that all changed with Diablo. Now, do we think of Japanese RPGs a lot of times when we think of role-playing games? Yes, because they have released some of the more popular ones, such as the Final Fantasy series, the Pokemon series. But the Western RPG has its place, and it cemented its place with Diablo. Dungeon crawling, loot collecting, the sweet, sweet loot collecting. Going through the dungeon, fighting through all the enemies in rapid combat, and taking down the boss at the end of the dungeon, if for nothing else than to see what type of loot he drops. Get that next weapon up. Get that gold so you can buy the new armor. Or at the luck that you get the highest level of armor dropping and not having to spend your gold on it. That is staples of the Diablo series, of the Dungeon Crawler series. And they wouldn't exist without the massive success that was the original Diablo. Number 3, Street Fighter 2. Now, if first-person shooters aren't the most popular overdone genre in gaming history, then that would belong to the fighting game. And a lot of people would jump to Mortal Kombat or Mortal Kombat 2 as the most important fighting game of all time. But what is the most edited, remade, rebooted, ported game of all time? To this day, over 25 years later, Street Fighter 2 is still getting edited and remade and ported and upscaled. It got ported to the Nintendo Switch in 2017, and this game was released in 1991. Fighting games as we know them would not exist without Street Fighter 2. Street Fighter 2 laid the groundwork for everything we know about fighting games ever. The rosters of characters, signature moves, over-the-top animations. All that started with Street Fighter 2. And it is still one of the most popular games in history. You were not a cool gamer unless you had a copy of Street Fighter 2, whether it had been on the SNES or Sega or whatever. Street Fighter 2 was where it was at when you invited your friends over to play video games. Number 2, Pokemon Red, Blue, and Yellow. Pokemon Red, Blue, and Yellow were an absolute phenomenon that to this day, the game series is still an absolute phenomenon. You can't go anywhere without seeing some form of Pokemon, whether it be someone collecting the plushes, or someone playing the card game, or someone playing Pokemon Go, or someone with a 3DS in their hand trying to beat the Elite Four. And it all started over 20 years ago with Pokemon Red and Blue and the extension that was Yellow. It took all the tropes we know and innovated them. Catching of the Pokemon, building of team, leveling up, evolution, the battle system. Most of it stayed untouched to this day. You can tout and say the importance of Gold and Silver, or Ruby and Sapphire, or X and Y. And all those games hold their mass amounts of importance in different areas. But when it comes to the Pokemon series as a whole, nothing touches Red and Blue. And the Pokemon series is another one of the most high-selling and popular game franchises of all time that wouldn't have got where it is without the success of its innovator, and that was Pokemon Red and Blue. Number 1, Super Mario Bros. Well, let's just put it this way. When you dig an entire industry out of a hole that it dug itself into 2 years prior, you're gonna rank pretty high on the list. And when you are the bundled game with the most important video game console that dug an entire industry out of a hole that it dug itself into 2 years prior, you are the most important video game in history. The Super Mario Brothers sold the Nintendo Entertainment System. In 1983, E.T. and Pac-Man for the Atari 2600 killed the video game industry. The bubble burst, and they buried unsold copies of those games in a landfill in New Mexico. And the video game industry wasn't heard from until 1985, when a Japanese company that used to sell trading cards called Nintendo sold this box You plug it into your TV, comes with 2 games, Duck Hunt and Super Mario Brothers. Now, Duck Hunt holds its place, but Super Mario Brothers was the video game. The music, the jumping, the platforming, the sounds, the trying to beat it in a quicker time than your friend across the street did, the hearing of the secret area where you could jump from the beginning to the end of the game and beat the game in less than 10 minutes. Everything about Super Mario Brothers changed, saved, innovated, revolutionized. Any buzzword you can use to describe importance in video games applies to Super Mario Brothers. We wouldn't have a modern video game industry if it wasn't for Super Mario Brothers. So the next time you turn on your PS4 or your Xbox One or your Nintendo Switch, I want you to give a thanks to Super Mario Bros. For allowing the video game industry to thrive after Atari had allowed it to die with oversaturation and leaving games unchecked in terms of quality and overworking the developers. Because if it wasn't for the Super Mario Brothers, we likely wouldn't have a video game industry to love today. And with that, I have been Walter from Unlimited. Don't forget to like, comment, share, subscribe. Follow us on Twitter @Unlimited1. And until next time, I will speak to you again soon.